Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear alumni, dear guests, dear friends of the MCI, dear media partners, which is today the Tiroler Tageszeitung and the Südtiroler Wirtschaftszeitung, and dear friends from the US Embassy in Vienna, thank you so much for being here. It is a great pleasure to open this little event on the topic of US foreign policy of the Biden administration. And we have a very, very distinguished guest sharing his expertise. He is James Lindsay, now presently sitting in Washington, D.C., and he is Senior Vice President of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Thank you so much for being here, dear James.
Thank you very much for having me, Andres, and I really appreciate the MCI hosting me, and also the U.S. Embassy in Vienna for making this possible.
Now, the topic of today, it couldn't be more to the point, and we are very, very grateful to have this opportunity, and the institution having allowed us and supported us to organize this event and to bring our distinguished guest of today in is the U.S. Embassy. Let me express a very warm welcome to Teta Moos. She is sitting in Vienna at the U.S. Embassy in Vienna. Dear Teta, thank you so much for being here and for your partnership.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Now, before I start with some technical explanations how this will work today, I would like to give the floor to Teta to say some words on behalf of the U.S. Embassy. Thank you for being here again.
All right. I am so thrilled that we're able to partner again with MCI. Thank you to Director Altman for being a partner with us over the years. And James Lindsay, I understand that you've been here before. I just arrived in July, but this is your second time with us. And we appreciate your sharing your expertise. And just a little disclaimer, when we do speaker programs, the U.S. Embassy invites folks from the United States and sometimes other locations too, to talk about U.S.-Austria relations and a whole host of topics. And we're always thrilled that we can get someone to share ideas and to have a conversation with our many participants. I do want to mention, since you allow me to do this, we do have a lot of other programs going on. Of course, they're all virtual right now. But that's okay, especially in February for Black History Month. We have some live stream programs on Facebook. And we'll also have additional programs on administration topics in the months to come. Vienna programs at state.gov is the email that you can send to sign up for invitations or to get a newsletter from us. Vienna programs at state.gov again. But with that, I just want to say thank you for joining us today and for the partnership. I am looking forward to a wonderful program.
Thank you so much, Teta. Teta Moos is not just sitting in Vienna in the US Embassy. She has a very clear function there. She is Counselor on Public Affairs, and the MCI has been working together with the US Embassy for many reasons and in many successful outcomes. We have been now engaging in roughly 20 academic partnerships, offering student exchange, faculty exchange, Fulbright professorships, Marshall Plan scholarships, and much more. And this little series with distinguished guest speakers may add and contribute to our successful collaboration. So let me once again express our gratitude to the US Embassy.
Thank you.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, we will be, you will be leaving us now, Theta, and we will bring the attention to our distinguished guest of today. And I've been already, or he has been already saying something. James Lindsay, you are Senior Vice President of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and you are sitting in Washington, D.C. now. Now, what is the function, what is the Council on Foreign Relations in New York doing?
Well, Andreas, the Council on Foreign Relations is an organization that's been around for a century. We were founded in 1921, so we are now enjoying our centennial year. We are at our core a membership organization of leading people in the United States interested in foreign affairs. I should note that we are nonpartisan. We are also independent. We're not tied to any political party. We take no funds from any governments, United States or otherwise. But the Council also is active as a publisher and as a think tank. And it is that think tank, the David Rockefeller Studies Program, that I oversee for the Council.
Now, if you do not receive public funding, how is the funding then work, and what are key activities? Some of them you mentioned already, as a think tank and so on.
Well, the funding for the Council has a variety of sources. Two major ones would be over the years. Our members have given us money to form an endowment, which goes to pay our costs. We also, in the studies program, raise a lot of money from philanthropies, foundations here in the United States. The United States, as I'm sure you know, has a long history of foundations that provide money so research organizations like the one I oversee can conduct research.
We as Austrians may be quite jealous on your culture of endowments and philanthropy and fundings. And there's always an explanation that you know, we have so high taxes that people have already the feeling they are giving enough, but there is never black and white. There's never 0 and 1 decision. So we would hope for more culture in this respect in Austria in general, and obviously as a university institution. Now, James, you have such a comprehensive vita, including so many different steps in your career. Now, what would you see is the key steps you would think are worthwhile to mention, bringing you to this function where you are now?
Well, probably two things, Andreas. And just to go back to your last comment, I should note that we realize how fortunate we are to have an endowment that makes it possible for us to do the kind of work we do. We're essentially in the ideas business in foreign policy, generating greater understanding of issues and suggesting how people can go about addressing challenges and seizing opportunities. In terms of my career, the two things, I guess, is one, I'm an academic by training. I have a doctorate in political science. I taught in college for a number of years, and also served in the US government on the staff of the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. So I've had government experience. Much of the work we do really lies at the intersection of sort of basic research, academic research, in policy making. And so those are really the sort of things that enabled me to sort of move from being on a university campus to being in a think tank and overseeing the work of a think tank. And along the way, I've written a lot of books. My most recent one with Ivo Dalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, was called The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership, which came out 2 years ago.
So, political scientist, and your academic ground, your alma mater or alma maters are which ones?
My undergraduate work was done at the University of Michigan, and my PhD is from Yale University.
Mm-hmm. Big names, big brands in the academic landscape, and not just there. Now, when we get closer to our topic of today, now U.S. foreign policy of the Biden administration, what would you see are the key pillars of this U.S. foreign policy of this administration, as far as we can tell now? And perhaps before you get started with your answer, let me just briefly give some technical advice for those now listening to us, either on our MCI live stream channel, or on YouTube, or on Facebook, or on LinkedIn, wherever you may be now. Please feel invited to send questions. The questions will directly land here on my screen, which I have directly in front of me, and I will be willing and more than pleased to bring them in as much as I can and to my best, however they may be fitting in well in a certain context. But I will, I promise you that I will do my best to put them forward. But now, what would you see, dear James, as key pillars of this administration?
Well, Andreas, let me sort of sketch out 3 points about the Biden foreign policy. And the first one is going to sound a bit unusual, because I think to understand the Biden foreign policy, you have to understand that for President Biden, domestic policy is job one. Now, I know candidate Biden, now President Biden, has spoken a lot about America being back, about how he wants to tackle foreign policy issues. But the reality for the Biden administration is that they were elected largely because Americans want him to grapple with the pressing domestic challenges facing the country. And foremost among that is handling the pandemic crisis. I don't think it's any secret that the Trump administration mismanaged the response to the pandemic. The death toll here in the United States is roughly 450,000 people. That's one of the highest death tolls per capita in the world. We have vaccines being rolled out, but that vaccine rollout has been plagued by a number of problems, largely because of the handoff from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And as important as foreign policy is to Joe Biden personally, he understands that he needs to make a down payment on his promises domestically to be able to succeed politically. I think he also understands that U.S. policy has been damaged in recent years. American soft power has been hurt, but also a sense of American competence. You know, can the United States get things done? So I think part of what he wants to show is the U.S. government can do things. Second point I would make about Joe Biden's foreign policy is that he sees his task first and foremost as knitting together and repairing America's relations with its traditional friends, partners, and allies. He looks at America first as, in some ways, an aberration that has greatly strained America's relations with countries around the world, and that result, or the result of that, has been to weaken America's position in the world. I think a fundamental premise of Joe Biden's worldview is that having friends, partners, and allies makes America safer and more prosperous. That is, he doesn't see, as Donald Trump did, America's partners and allies as threats or costs, but as opportunities and advantages. In some sense, looking at it as we are stronger together. And I think one of the things you're seeing early on from Joe Biden's foreign policy team is a desire to reach out to countries around the world to reassure them that the United States is looking to work with them. Now, these are extremely experienced foreign policy hands. They don't labor under any illusion that they can somehow magically go back to some time prior. They realize there are lots of issues that divide the United States and its closest allies, even looking at the transatlantic relationship, but they believe that nurturing and reinvigorating those relations are critical to the United States. Third point I would make, if you look at Joe Biden's foreign policy, the one he hopes to launch, is that his top foreign policy priorities are to dissuade China from its recent path of aggressiveness and to pursue progress on climate change, which President Biden, unlike President Trump, regards as an existential threat. I think those are the top priorities. They're hoping to concentrate their efforts on them, but they labor under several challenges, one of which is just getting the US government staffed up. The United States is unique among advanced democracies in terms of changeover between administrations. We essentially remove the total upper level of the US government, and then it has to be replenished or restocked. Many of those positions require Senate confirmation. Turns out that that's going to be very hard to do. We're now 13 days into the Biden presidency, and he has 5 confirmed cabinet secretaries. There are 14 other agencies that still await their heads to be confirmed, and that doesn't take into account deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries. So it's going to be some time before the full Biden team gets staffed up. The other challenge that Biden faces, obviously, is going to be, as much as he wants to concentrate on China and on climate change, his foreign policy inbox is full of lots of other messy, difficult challenges, some of which could force themselves to the top of the agenda very quickly. And here I'm thinking most obviously about Iran and its nuclear program, and obviously North Korea and its nuclear program. So that's sort of the broad context that I would lay out for you.
Mm-hmm. Now that has really brought a lot of food for thought for a discussion. And if I may just briefly start with some questions from my side. Now, from our point, the Trump administration in general, to put it very superficial, but would you use the word Jacksonian? Yeah, I'm not trying to use the word more. I mean, America first, that's one thing, but leave away all these difficult areas in the world. Let them deal with their issues, more or less, if we may call that Jacksonian, among other elements. But would you see a difference in this approach
between President Trump and President Biden? Yeah, well, I think, one of the interesting things about that question, and it's a very good one, is the difficulty of actually pinning down what the Trump administration's foreign policy was. And I think that's going to be sort of bedeviling historians and political analysts for a while, because at times there seemed to be a policy of the US government and then a policy of the United States president, and they didn't always align. And that was perhaps most obvious talking about Russia, where US foreign policy, think of the Defense Department, State Department, viewed Russia as a strategic competitor, whereas the president talked very fondly about President Putin and very seldom willingly held Russia to account for the actions that his own government was criticizing. But putting that aside, I think if you look at the two presidencies, there are going to be significant differences in style and tone, but perhaps for many non-Americans, surprising continuities at least on some issues. Let me talk about tone first. With Joe Biden, you are not going to have foreign policy being made by tweets at 3 a.m. in the morning Washington time. You are not going to have an administration which one group of senior officials says policy is one thing and then contradicted by other officials saying policy is something else. Joe Biden has surrounded himself with a group of very seasoned, experienced Washington hands. So I expect on that level, you're going to get a fair degree of consistency. You're going to see a real methodical approach to foreign policy issues. And you're not going to see the sort of rhetorical flourishes that you saw with Donald Trump, like talking about the leader of North Korea as Little Rocket Man, or red buttons on the desk, or trade wars in the case of China being good and easy to win. So stylistically, night and day. On substance, definitely a lot of change on specific issues. Maybe the most obvious one is climate change, where Joe Biden has already announced the United States will be rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. Likewise, the United States under Biden has ended the withdrawal process from the World Health Organization. So like lots of other issues we can go into, quite different. Obviously also, I think Iran, where they hope to get back into the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. But on other issues, I think China most notably, I think you're going to see more continuity than change, and that reflects the fact that there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States that the policy of engagement with China that really sort of originated in the Bill Clinton administration hasn't worked. The hope that as China got wealthier, it would become a responsible stakeholder in the existing system, as it was often put, hasn't turned out to be the case. That China's actions recently, both domestically, think the Uyghurs, think Hong Kong, but also in foreign policy, think its behavior in the South China Sea, its intimidation of Japan and South Korea, the military clashes in the Himalayas, all suggest that China is not seeking to become part of the global system, but to fundamentally change it in ways that undermine U.S. and Western interests and values.
Well, you have been mentioning China quite a number of times, and there will be more or less, let's say, continuity with some obviously differences, but to a smaller extent. But what would that, for instance, mean to Taiwan, to the Philippines, to Japan? How would you see this evolve? Will there be continuity, more or less in strategic terms, but when it comes more to operational or to special issues, how would you see that?
Well, I have to begin by noting that the Biden administration has said that it is going to take the first several months of Biden's presidency to conduct a strategic review of U.S. policy toward China, which again covers not just military issues like what happens with Taiwan or the status of islands in the South China Sea, but obviously trade issues and the like, and that gets tied up with a broader array of issues. So the Biden administration wants to take its time. And again, it has an additional reason to take its time, given that it's going to be several months before the Biden foreign policy team is fully stocked up. Having said that, I think you're going to see continuity in the military domain, likely to continue. And by that, I mean the United States, since its founding, has championed the idea of freedom of navigation. It's a core principle of American foreign policy over the centuries across political parties. And the great concern is that China is seeking to deny freedom of naval operations, particularly in the South China Sea. So beginning under the Obama administration, but certainly accelerated during the Trump administration, has been the Navy, U.S. Navy's pursuit of freedom of naval operations. This is standard. The United States does this around the world to stand up for the principle embedded in international law of freedom of the seas. The United States even conducts freedom of naval operations with Canada to indicate that certain passages are open for all ships to use. I expect that aspect to continue. Likewise, the Trump administration really sort of increased American contact or support for Taiwan. Now, as you know, the United States has not regarded Taiwan as a country ever since Jimmy Carter formally recognized mainland China back in 1979. And in U.S. law, Taiwan has a special status. We are committed to the peaceful reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. Now, obviously, China regards Taiwan as a core interest and has increasingly taken a more threatening posture toward the island, raising concerns that we may see an attempt to force Taiwan to return to the mainland. And I think that's one of the flashpoints, if you want to use that term, for American policymakers as they look particularly at East Asia, that is an area that could be quite difficult and will be a thorn in U.S. relations with China.
Mm-hmm. Now, if the topic of China and East Asia is so large and so comprehensive, so we even can perhaps scratch at the surface. But if being now in Europe, I know the principal attention will be on Europe in our audience. So let me switch or shift the attention to Europe. Now, if we try to look a little backwards into the last years, or actually in larger strategies, there is the one. The Romans called it divide impera, so a divide and rule. So would there be an interest in a strong Europe, unified Europe, to have a global partner, or would the interest rather be in a weakened Europe and rather talking to the German Chancellor and the French President and so on? How would you see this evolving, including obviously UK, your the privileged partnership with the United Kingdom?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, and it's obviously a big and complicated question. You mentioned that talking about China or U.S. policy in Asia is complicated. It is. I didn't even get into the issues involving trade and the like. And I think that same level of complexity, Andreas, really sort of hits home when we're talking about the transatlantic relationship. I'll make a couple of quick points, probably three. One is that the transatlantic relationship is really core to Biden's sort of theory of foreign policy. Again, when we talk about how he wants to bring together America's traditional friends, partners, and allies, front and center in that grouping is Europe. And there's no denying that. And I don't want in any way suggest that people in the Biden team have some idealized vision of what the transatlantic relationship was like for 75 years. We have been very close, but we've clearly had our differences. Some of the high points, obviously, Vietnam, deployment of Pershing IIs, the Iraq War, we all know that history. So there's no naivete in terms of the Biden administration and understanding that we don't always see things the same way. But again, clearly, first and foremost, we need to rebuild the transatlantic relationship. Second thing is, I think that in doing that, the view of the Biden administration is that a strong Europe is in America's interest. The United States wants Europe to be able to do things. And indeed, in many cases, the United States has argued that Europe can do more than it has done. And I think that obviously goes back to the Obama administration. And so I think that, and again, when you just think about Brexit, the argument that had come out of Washington, I think this was really a bipartisan argument, even though Barack Obama was president at the time, that from the American point of view, a Britain in the EU was a better partner than a Britain outside of the EU. Now, the British made a different choice, and that's been settled. The United States will have to work with it. But again, I think the main orientation is a strong Europe is in America's interest. Third point I will make, that even as the United States works with Europe, the United States also recognizes that Europeans themselves disagree on some of these issues. And you pick an issue, you'll find that as you go from Latvia and Estonia in the northeast to Spain and Portugal in the southwest, that attitudes on what the priority is, what the right strategy is, who should do what changes. So the United States is both going to work with Europe writ large, but obviously with individual countries within Europe. And I don't see those two as necessarily being in tension or being a contradiction.
Now, you were very polite when mentioning that Europe could already, that was part of the Obama philosophy, that Europe could do more regarding the investment. I mean, maybe in military terms, but also in global engagement and so on. But you did say could do more. Trump then more or less said should do more or ought to be more. How would you see that the Biden administration? I would expect, also from his perspective, that he would continue on putting or requesting Europe to do more, so should do more. How would you see that?
Well, that's a big question that I think the Biden team is yet to fully work out. Again, and one of the interesting things about American politics is that on the campaign, presidential candidates talk about what they want to do. And on the campaign trail, you're sketching visions, you're not dealing with the trade-offs. Once you win and become president, then you have to sort of try to reconcile all of your promises, the things you want to do, with all the constraints you face at home and abroad to determine what you get to do. And I think the Biden team is now working its way through that process. I think that for the Biden team, they're probably not going to elevate the issue of contributions to NATO to quite the level that President Trump did. I will note, though, and I'm sure the Biden people will say this a lot, the following two things. Number one, Americans have long been urging Europe to spend more in the military. I mean, I can remember John F. Kennedy, when I read his first State of the Union address, one of the things he complained about was Europe was not spending enough. So this has been a long-standing complaint. But the second thing the Biden team is going to say is, listen, at the Wales summit back in 2014, Europe pledged to do this. This is what Europeans say they will do. We expect them to make good on their word, just as they want us to make good on our word. I expect that. I think that, when dealing with Europe, the real interesting questions are going to be on the issues that the Biden administration has at the top of its priority list, namely China. And here, I think there's reason to be concerned that there's not going to be a meeting of the minds between Washington and countries in Europe. I think the Biden people were very disappointed with the rush in December to ink the EU-China investment deal. Clearly, the Biden people, to the extent they could signal their hopes and aspirations, given they weren't yet in power, was that they would have preferred the whole thing to have been slowed down so that the United States could have consultations with the Europeans. Europe went ahead, largely at the behest of Germany. I note that this week, Chancellor Merkel gave a speech which seemed to indicate that she doesn't think Germany should choose sides, or maybe I should say it could be read as suggesting that Germany shouldn't choose sides between China and the United States and contribute to the formation of blocs. I think that from the vantage point of the Biden administration would be very troubling. Again, I'm not sure how much Chancellor Merkel speaks for all of Europe on that question. But clearly, one of the big issues going forward in transatlantic relations is going to be the question of how to deal with China. And I'll just say, related to that, obviously, there are going to be big differences between Washington and Brussels over the whole suite of issues on trade, but particularly on tech companies, digital taxation, and things like that. And again, on one hand, you can going to say, well, how can we talk about a transatlantic relationship when we're having food fights over digital taxes? But I think, again, if you have the benefit of history and look back, you say, well, we've been fighting over issues like this for a very long time. And for the most part, we've been able, even though it's been messy on occasion, to reach accommodations. And the hope is we can continue to do so. And again, I think the Biden worldview would say the United States and Europe are both better off working together than they are either alone or against each other.
I do not have any official interpretation of the European policy towards Russia, and I doubt whether there is a European policy on that. But you have, the tendency that now regarding the relationship with the United States, there is some voices saying, and quite strong voices saying, let us reiterate the issue of our relationship with Russia. Let's more or less get closer to, get rid of the sanctions, stop them, get into new economic relations and so on, and that would be to our benefit. And obviously that may be not the perspective or maybe not the interest of the United States. How would you see that issue on, for instance, the Baltics, but very much Ukraine, Crimea and so on?
Another great question. Obviously, this is going to be a challenge for the Biden administration because Europe is not of one mind on how to go forward on policy toward Russia. Now, I will note in the United States, there's a great deal of concern about Russian policy. And as you know, the United States has put a large number of sanctions on Russia to express its disapproval. It's likely to impose more sanctions, certainly on individuals in the Russian government, given the events surrounding the arrest and likely long-term imprisonment of Alexei Navalny. And I think you're going to see the Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, be much more publicly critical of Russian behavior and to try to shine a spotlight on that. I think, though, that the Biden team is likely to proceed with a pretty pragmatic approach to Russia. I don't think they have high hopes that they can, to borrow a term that got a lot of criticism when Barack Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton used it back in 2009, 2010, a reset with Russia. I don't think they believe that's possible. I do believe that they are going to be looking for places where they can cooperate, most notably with the extension of the New START Treaty, which was set to expire this coming Friday. But I don't know that they have ambitions or expectations that something bigger can happen. And obviously, as you look at that policy, and this is true of all policies, you begin with sort of your starting perspective, but everything gets buffeted and potentially changed by events. Now we have protests in Moscow. Obviously, we have continued protests in neighboring Belarus. There are concerns about a variety of issues in Ukraine. And so that's going to provide real challenges for the Biden people. But again, I think if you're looking at sort of how the Biden administration thinks of its priorities, I don't think Russia policy is up on the same level of a priority as China is. And again, I don't think that the Biden people see room currently for any transformational act with U.S.-Russian relations. Just one final thing quickly, of course, keep in mind, is that, as you know, the Russian intelligence agencies conducted a massive attack on American digital networks and was ongoing. And there clearly is bipartisan desire here in the United States to make Russia pay a price for its espionage. And of course, the question is exactly how do you do that, particularly when you've sanctioned quite a lot of things already. So there's that sort of tension here in the background here in Washington. So I don't think that the Biden team is going to be inclined to be overly friendly toward Moscow unless Moscow makes a very large gesture of its own, and that doesn't seem to be in the offing.
So as I've been seeing so many questions coming in to fulfill my promise to do my best to bring them in, but to sum it up, I know this is very roughly. Would you more or less agree on saying that there will be largely continuity with respect to the relationship towards Russia, but less of attention? And a shift of global attention, very strong shift to China. You know?
I think broadly speaking, that describes what we're likely looking at, Andreas. Of course, again, the wild card in all of this is events. Sure. The Mike Tyson, the world champion boxer, liked to say that everyone who enters the ring has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And I think that sort of reality applies in politics as well. Everybody has plans, and then events have a way of complicating things. So in that, we're really tested the ability of the Biden team to adjust to what they face.
I think Mike Tyson was a wise guy saying this. Now,
I think he learned it the hard way. So it was an accumulated experience through the College of Hard Knocks, so to speak.
Now, let me jump into some questions, and I'm not sure whether I'm really capable to bring them in a logic order, but okay. Now, Omar Al-Rawi, he's member of the Regional Parliament of Vienna, a member of the City Council of the City Vienna, and he asks now, how would Biden, U.S. President Biden, play a positive role for peace in Syria and Iraq, considering the negative way Iran is dealing there? Any hope?
That is a tough question. Now, let me first just go on the record, since this is a member of the City Council of Vienna. You have one of the most beautiful and wonderful cities in the world. So I just want to recognize Vienna for what it is. I actually lived for a very long time in Vienna, Virginia. And I can simply say that Vienna, Virginia does not begin to compare with Vienna, Austria. The Middle East broadly, not just Syria, but the Middle East broadly is a tough problem for the United States and will be for the Biden administration. I don't think that the Biden administration sees much of an opportunity to improve things on the ground in Syria. This has been a problem that's bedeviled the Obama administration, the Trump administration. I think it will now bedevil the Biden administration. But if I can take it back momentarily, I think it takes us to this big issue for the Biden team that they're hoping to make progress on, and they may or may not, which is to try to rework the nuclear deal with Iran and to get Iran back into the deal. And the idea animating the Biden team is that the deal, which the United States left under the Trump administration, so the Iranians have walked away from, has its flaws, but it's the best starting point we have. And what they want to do is to make the agreement longer, stronger, and broader. Longer in terms of how long those provisions in the 2015 deal last. Stronger in the sense of making sure that Iran is complying, so we're talking about verification. And broader so that it goes beyond simply nuclear activities to include ballistic missile activities and also Iran's activities in the region. And it's easy to sketch it out as a goal of Biden foreign policy. It's very hard to see how they're going to do it. And again, I think one thing to watch for over the next several months is whether we get back into the nuclear deal or something like it. And again, the wild card operating here is that Iran has a presidential election, I believe this coming June. And so Iran has its own internal domestic politics, as does Joe Biden. If you talk about Russia policy or China policy as reflecting a great deal of bipartisanship in the United States, what's characteristic of U.S. policy on Iran is that there's an absence of bipartisanship. People are divided, not just between Democrats and Republicans, but also within the Democratic Party about how to handle Iran. And again, the United States has been engaged in a confrontation with Iran dating back to 1979, so it's more than 4 decades. And it's been a pretty tragic track record. It's been very hard for the United States to work with the Iranians. And again, the Iranians, when they hear longer, stronger, and broader, their reaction is, heck no. We agreed to a deal in 2015, and we're not inclined to open it up to cover other sorts of activities. And indeed, we're not even sure we want to go back in, given that it was the United States, after all, that reneged on its word to abide by the 2015 deal.
Excuse me.
Take your time.
Thank you. Sorry. Now, Professor Gerhard Mangot, he holds, he's professor of political science at the University of Innsbruck. Excuse me. And he asks specifically on Iran, will the Biden administration insist on Iran taking the first step and get in compliance again with the joint comprehensive plan of action?
That is what the Biden administration has signaled, that their hope is that the Iranian government will take steps to get back into the agreement. And then when those steps are taken, that will create diplomatic and political space for the United States to make reciprocal actions. That's their hope. It's not clear it's going to be that easy to do. And again, we're sort of, waiting on word. There was, in the last several months, the Iranians have sort of moved further away from the JCPOA. They brought new centrifuges online. They begin to give them feedstock, so they're beginning to enrich. They're moving away from the terms of the agreement, which I should note was negotiated in Vienna. So I think that, the challenge for the Biden administration is whether Iran offers the sort of step that they can seize on. Now, of course, conversely, the Iranian argument has been quite clear. We're not the ones who left the agreement. The United States needs to do something. And obviously, there have been Iranians saying not only should the United States act first, but we should be compensated for the harm that we have endured because the United States left the agreement. Now, that's a non-starter here in the United States, but if Iran is serious about it, it's obviously an obstacle to moving towards some kind of a deal. One thing none of us know is what kind of back channel conversations might be happening, either directly or through third parties. Great advantage for secrecy, and what sort of intelligence either side has on that score. But I think if you are in the Biden team, your best scenario is you get movement toward getting back into the 2015 nuclear deal. Their nightmare is that Iran makes a dash to gain a nuclear capability. And it's a problem because it sort of squarely puts on the table what the United States is going to do to stand by its vow not to allow Iran to, quote, go nuclear. And again, as Andres, it ties up to everything that's in the region, because American partners like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel have a great deal at stake in what happens with the Iranian nuclear program and also about Iran's regional activities. So it can be diplomatically very difficult for the Biden team.
We're jumping back and forth now, but Philip Redding, he asks now, what could be a new global balance of power look like? Would Taiwan have to be sacrificed? Might Chinese expansionism end then?
Wow, that is a big question. It's also, admittedly, a very difficult one to answer. What is the old saying? It's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. I think this applies here. As you look at it, and there are a couple of possible paths we can go down. Maybe it's worthwhile to sketch them out. Sketch out three of them. One is one in which China sets its ambitions essentially on supplanting the United States as the global superpower, and really trying to rewrite the rules of the game so that all the rules favor China. This is the great fear that many countries in East and Southeast Asia have. They have memories of the tributary system that used to exist, and their fear is that China is essentially bent on pushing the United States out of the Pacific and establishing dominion over certainly East Asia, Southeast Asia, potentially even South Asia. Obviously, the Indians have some say on that score. Another possibility that you could see going to the opposite end is that the United States and China can negotiate some semblance of an accommodation, which doesn't really sort of fundamentally upend the existing series of international institutions, but rather readjust them. Certainly can make an argument for them. I think that implicitly that was part of the idea behind the engagement philosophy that successive U.S. administrations had over the last quarter century. In between that, you could simply end up with essentially regional blocs where China's goals aren't really global, but merely regional, potentially dominating sort of its neighborhood. The United States, presumably dominating the Western Hemisphere, Europe on its own. I guess you could create a fourth sort of group with Russia in its near abroad. But there are many different ways that these things can go. I think one of the challenges is that certainly some of these potential outcomes we would only reach through possible conflict, which would be quite horrific and dangerous. And there's also the possibility that you could get to some of these states, you might avoid conflict, but we will discover that all of us are much poorer, less prosperous, not just than we might be, but than we currently are. There is nothing that says history has to move in a linear fashion where we get happier and healthier year by year. You can see over the course of history that it's well known to you that countries and civilizations can take major steps back.
That was really a rough question, and we will jump to another difficult question, but on a totally different topic. Now, Udo Gennari, he is working at the Business Upper Austria Wirtschaftsagentur, and he is managing research and innovation support programs. Now, and he asks, are there any plans to join forces with the European Union to ensure proper IP handling for foreign companies producing and developing in China?
That's a good question. It probably takes me to the boundaries of my area of expertise. So let me make two quick points. One is that, broadly speaking, that's what the Biden team hopes will happen, that the United States will be able to work with Europe on a variety of issues dealing with common standards, and that the combined weight of it will be so significant that China will have to reach accommodations. That, I think, is it in a nutshell. The second point I make is that, again, this is easy to sketch writ large, but obviously any effort like this has consequences for American firms and for European firms, and the fallout may not be consistent, right? The United States is likely to do things that will advantage American firms, and that is likely to alarm Europeans. Obviously, in a number of these areas, I think Europe is concerned about the dominance of American tech firms, that Europe ends up in a situation in which essentially it is dependent upon what the United States does. And obviously, they would like to see to have some autonomy or greater control. And overlay that with fundamental differences about what technology should be allowed to do and the like, and you can find the occasion for a lot of people to sit around tables in conference rooms arguing interminably. So these are, big questions. They're complicated questions, and they're consequential. And I think that's why you're going to need American diplomats and European diplomats and technically oriented people to try to work these things to find areas of accommodation. We've done so in the past, but of course, the past doesn't always predict the future.
Now, I have, thank you so much. Another, quite, I think, interesting anyhow, but quite challenging question is coming from Georg Singewald. He's sitting in San Francisco now, and he is vice president of a global pharmaceutical company, and also teaching at the MCI as an adjunct faculty. And he asks now, the world is looking at the changes in the foreign policies of the United States. And parts of the following question have already been answered. Now, what are the key principles of foreign allyship, and how are regions and other countries kept more accountable, and so on? At the same time, not felt left alone. I may take the liberty to focus on India and Pakistan. You have been mentioning Russia, or we have been mentioning Russia, we have been mentioning Syria, we have been, and so on, Iran, and Eastern Asia. But now, when it comes to the attempt to contain China expansion or Chinese activities, what about India and Pakistan? In history, or out of tradition, the closest ally was Pakistan. And India, I know this is a very rough description, and India was more, in history, tied strategically to Russia. That has been thrown up and down. Now, how would you see that now?
Wow. Well, you just sketched out a very complicated set of dynamics. And it is true that India during the Cold War was ally, got its weapons from the Soviet Union. Pakistan was a protege, I guess, of the United States, and things have switched. Now Pakistan has very good relations with China. Obviously, a lot of talk about China using Pakistan as a gateway to the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and the rest. So that remains the case. I will say that, looking at the bilateral relationship the United States has had with both Pakistan and India, it has been fraught over the years. I think it's the politest way to put it. The United States has been very frustrated by both countries. I think clearly since the George W. Bush administration, the United States has wanted to develop a strategic partnership, if I can use that phrase, with India. I think India, both by virtue of recent history and longer term history, doesn't necessarily see itself as sort of signing up to be led by the United States. So the term like partnership tends to make many Indian officials, I think, annoyed. Having said that, I think that for India, the confrontation it has been having with China makes New Delhi, more concerned about having closer relationships with the United States, not necessarily to contain China. I don't think even U.S. policy is about containing China. I think fundamentally U.S. policy to China is different than U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union. So talk about a new Cold War, I think, is just fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the interaction. It's really about deterring the Chinese from doing certain things or nudging them in a different direction. So I think, the Biden administration clearly will want to develop its ties with India. But again, there's going to be a challenge there, which is the sort of more Hindu nationalist nature of Indian politics, which I think doesn't really sort of sit well with the human rights agenda that the Biden administration is also going to have. And I guess there's a big lesson here for the Biden administration. I can't think of any bilateral relationship that doesn't come with irritants or problems between Washington and the other capital. I mean, let's just take the United States and Canada. We share a very long, essentially open border. And there are things that the Biden administration has done in its first 13 days, which has really annoyed Ottawa, led by the cancellation of the so-called Keystone XL pipeline, which is seen as an environmental issue here in the United States, but seen as an economic issue in Canada. And that's why you have diplomats try to find ways to work around the very many irritants that exist in your relationship so that the things you share outweigh the things that divide you.
Now we are really exploiting your knowledge, and there is another question now. This is coming from Leo Stolwitzer. He works at the U.S. Embassy in Vienna, and coming back to the Middle East. Now, the U.S. relations with Israel and the Middle East. The precise question, will Biden relocate the U.S. Embassy from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv? What do you mean?
That's a very easy question to answer, Andreas, because the answer is no. Now Secretary of State Antony Blinken, in his confirmation hearing, when he was getting approval by the Senate, said that the U.S. government would not de-recognize Jerusalem as the capital and re-recognize Tel Aviv. So I think that's not going to change. There's a more complicated question about the status of the Golan Heights. As you might know, the Trump administration recognized the Golan Heights or the annexation of the Golan Heights, something that prior U.S. presidents had declined to do. I don't know whether the State Department may revisit that, because obviously there are a number of precedents or recognizing it creates precedents that may run afoul of other things the Biden team hopes to accomplish. So that one I don't know where they've netted out.
Mm-hmm. Now, moving to climate change, Christian Maasberger has sent me a question, and actually a number of questions. So I may just try to sum them up regarding, now President Biden has pledged to make the U.S. climate neutral, by 2050 or earlier, which matches the goal of the European Union and the Paris Agreement. By fact, the European Union, the United States, and China are the world's three most predominant main emitters. Now, how would you see this relation, or how would you see this evolve? Will the United States, for instance, actively approach China, actively approach Europe, and not just re-enter the agreement, but now really make concrete plans of actions?
Excellent question. I say at the broadest level, yes, though we may not all agree on what's meant by actively approach. So let me just sort of take a step back and say, first and foremost for Joe Biden is that he is trying to make the pitch to the American public that, one, climate change is an existential threat that we must address and must address now. Two, that if we address that threat, it is not a cost, but actually an opportunity. Now, of course, with President Trump made precisely the opposite argument. He argued that climate change wasn't happening. It was something being cooked up to basically hurt the American economy. Joe Biden's case is we can do this and we can create new jobs. That's his pitch. Number two, most of what he is going to do on climate change, if he's going to make a difference, is to change what's happening in the United States domestically. He's already coming out of the gate, done a number of things with regulations using the so-called executive power, executive orders to change things. But to really make a big difference, he needs to get Congress to pass legislation. Mm-hmm. And here we get to the gridlock, polarization in American politics that make it very hard to move forward on this issue. Now, one thing he can hope for is that he is going to get a lot of support from the private sector. You may have heard that just in the last week, General Motors has said that it will stop making cars with internal combustion engines by, I think it's 2035. A number of other companies have talked about moving toward being carbon neutral. If that continues, that builds up momentum and the like. Cities and towns are doing a lot. And all this is good. The signs are good. Trends are good. But we can't underestimate the size of the problem ahead of us, because the climate is already changing. And that is a reality. Even if everybody stopped emitting this afternoon, there's a lot of momentum built up into the physical system. Third thing, when it comes to diplomacy, I think the biggest thing the Biden team can do is working with others to find ways to persuade the Chinese to drop their plans for building coal-fired power plants as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. There are, at least on the books, something like 200 of these power plants in various stages of construction. If those plants are built, that will make it really hard for us to do the kind of reduction in emissions that are necessary. But again, that is something that can't be done simply by the United States. It has to be done in concert with others, and it ultimately depends upon the willingness of the Chinese government to scrap the rather ambitious plan it has launched. And again, on this and on a lot of other issues, the Chinese say some things that are very positive, and then they do things that are very negative. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I can multiply. You can talk about the Chinese talk about respecting sovereignty, except when it comes to the South China Sea and the claims that the Philippines has. So this is going to be one of the big questions, Mark. American foreign policy can do a lot, but ultimately, a lot's going to depend upon the actions made in other capitals, and particularly the decisions made in Beijing.
Please apologize if I once in a while I need to look down on my screen to look at the questions, but my full attention is with you and with the audience. And now I have a very nice question from Dennis Harris. He's a master student at the MCI, and again, quite challenging, interesting and challenging question. Now, he has sent me two. I may pick one of them. How do you expect President Joe Biden and his administration to respond to the current protests in over 100 cities in Russia due to the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny?
It's a great question, and we're seeing it unfold in real time. I expect the Biden team to do what they have been doing since they came to office 13 days ago, and that is to publicly call Russia to account, to hopefully create, along with other countries, pressure on Russia to ease off on the imprisonment of Mr. Navalny. I don't think members of the Biden administration harbor any illusions about the likelihood that U.S. pressure is going to persuade Mr. Putin to handle the situation differently. But I do think that they're going to highlight it. Again, as I think I mentioned earlier, I would expect additional U.S. sanctions on Russia or on individuals associated with Mr. Navalny's arrest. But I don't know that that's really going to change things at the end of the day. Certainly my own view is that what happens in Russia is going to be driven primarily by decisions that Russians themselves make, and that the space for other countries to move Putin in a different direction is actually fairly limited. I also would expect that the Biden administration will try to coordinate to the extent Europe wants to speak with one voice on this, so that we have sort of a common Western, if I can use that term, position on the issue. But again, I think the events in Russia are very concerning, and they're well worth watching, and we'll see how they develop. And again, go back to a broader point here. You can have all the plans in the world, and they can be well thought out, but events can present you with a very different world than the one you thought you were going to inherit.
Now, James, we have been already making use of your time more than expected, but there are so many questions coming in. May we have some more minutes, some 10 minutes, if?
That'd be fun. I'm happy to do it.
All right.
I actually enjoyed doing a lot more if I actually got to go to Innsbruck to have this conversation, but at least I get to look at your background, which is very nice.
You know, you're touching my heart. It is, for us, it is so important to welcome guests from all over the world and bring them together directly with our students and with our faculty. So I hope we can work on that later on.
Well, see, I know that you have great cake, you have great coffee, you have great beer, you have great bread, great sausages. So that's pretty good.
There's nice academic institutions as well.
Yeah.
So now, Masha Omrani, I'm not familiar with his background, but he asks, it seems Biden is not very interested to intervene in the Iran-Israel conflict. This is the question now. Do you think if any war start between these two countries, does Biden has any intention to intervene in such a case?
Big question. My crystal ball is as cloudy as everybody else's. I think that from the vantage point of the Biden administration, they would like to avoid becoming more deeply involved in any conflicts in the Middle East. Again, you look at it from the vantage point of the United States, there's often talk about what's called the unending wars or the forever wars here in the United States. The United States has had troops in Afghanistan since October of 2001. Obviously, U.S. troops invaded Iraq in 2003 and left a bloody legacy. And if you talk to Americans, again, to go back to my opening point, what they want the Biden administration to do is to focus on solving the very many difficult problems here at home. They don't want to see what they would regard as foreign adventures. But again, events can really sort of change the choice set that presidents face. Again, the United States has commitments to a variety of countries in terms of defending them. And it's sort of hard to say whether the United States, what conditions under which the United States would act on those, because a lot depends upon the events itself and how things come about. But I have no reason to doubt that the Biden administration, as a general principle, endorses the commitments that the United States has had to a variety of countries in the region, not just Israel. I do think that the Biden team very much would like to find some way to produce a negotiated settlement and an end to the war in Yemen. And again, going back to the issue of the Iran nuclear deal, to find some way to pressure the Iranians to ratchet back their activities, their malign activities across the region, all the way to Levant. And they're going to pursue a variety of actions on that score.
Were you this question comes from me, were you personally surprised by the agreement between Israel and the Emirates? I mean, for me, it came quite surprising, but how do you see that?
It was good news, but I wouldn't say it was surprising news for me, at least for two reasons. One is that the Emiratis and the Israelis have had a variety of sort of off-the-books exchanges for quite a long time. They really weren't secret. Mm-hmm. The people who follow this knew that there were all kinds of understandings. And indeed, quickly when other countries followed, it became clear that sort of talks that were sort of happening, in the back room could now move out into the front room. And that was a positive step. Okay. I mean, it's easy to exaggerate the consequences. It wasn't as if the Emirates and Israel were at war and you were getting a peace. So it's not significant in the same way that the Egypt-Israel peace deal was, or the Jordanian-Israel peace deal was. However, it is important. It's good progress. The question is, can you move forward on it? The second thing I would say is when the Emiratis moved forward on this, they did it for a specific reason. They wanted Israel to take off the table, talk about annexation of the West Bank. And that seems to be something that is not going to happen, at least anytime soon. However, it doesn't solve the problem of the fate of the Palestinians, which is at the heart of the Middle East peace process. And I think, there are great questions about how this is going to go ahead. I do know that, the logic of the Abraham Accords was sort of what might be called the outside-in philosophy, that if you could get Arab countries to recognize Israel, that would put pressure on the Palestinians and you could forge a deal. The jury is still out on that theory, and a lot of it depends upon what it is that the Saudis do. And I think that will be an interesting question going forward. That is there a conceivable case in which Saudi Arabia will join the Abraham Accords, and what would have to happen for that to occur? And again, so the possibility of a major breakthrough is there. I wouldn't necessarily say that the probability of a major breakthrough is high. But again, to go back to diplomacy, this is partly why you have diplomats, to see if you can find ways to build on some successes to create even greater successes.
Brings us back to the saying of Mike Tyson, right?
Well, Mike Tyson, and I'm sure there are variations of the Mike Tyson's observation about how plans have to encounter reality.
Now, staying briefly at the Middle East, a country which has not been mentioned yet at all, but which plays a major role or has been starting to play a major role in the region is Turkey. And you have been using that both India and Pakistan, there was some, I think you said fraud with respect to the relationship, or with respect to the expectations of the U.S. Now, how would you see Turkey from the point of the United States now and the expected Biden administration?
Well, looking just at the India-Pakistan relationship, they're just difficult, contentious relationships. And I think you can move Turkey into the difficult, contentious relationship. And again, for a long time, the United States had very good relations with Turkey. Obviously, Turkey's a member of NATO, but clearly over the last 5 to 7 years, those relations have frayed. I know people who are experts on the U.S.-Turkish relationship would say that there's no longer any sort of strategic overlapping interest to bind us together. That may well be true. Obviously, the hopes that many American analysts of Turkey had that Turkey was moving in a democratic fashion have been dashed as Mr. Erdogan has moved in a more authoritarian direction. And obviously, when you look at Turkey's role in NATO and the tensions with Greece on a whole range of issues, but particularly on issues related to oil and gas deposits in the Eastern Mediterranean and the conflicting economic zones and the like, that there are real problems there. Now, one of the challenges, I think, for the Biden administration is going to be to what extent does it want to make relations with Turkey a priority? To what extent does it wish to inject itself in a role trying to work things out? And again, there are positive arguments to be made for doing so. There's also reasons to be perhaps, how shall I put this, conservative about the desire to sort of want to try to act as a mediator, given that European countries themselves are to some extent split. Other countries have sort of already become involved, and to what extent would American intervention complicate that further rather than resolve? And so I think that's one of the things they have to deal with, which is why, whether you are a fan of Joe Biden or not a fan of Joe Biden, the Biden administration, I think we all can agree that, again, in the foreign policy inbox, there are just a lot of issues that could test the guile and savvy of anyone. Just that there are a whole lot of them, and you got to figure out, which ones you want to invest your time and energy in. It's the old saying that if everything is a priority, nothing is. And I think that applies here as well.
Now, I feel we really need to come to an end, and perhaps I may put forward one last question coming from Elma Doleji. And he points to the fact that the topic of today is U.S. foreign policy of the Biden administration. So not just on U.S. foreign policy, but of the Biden administration. Now the question: do you expect that Vice President Kamala Harris will play a leading role in U.S. foreign policy regarding looking at her background, her interest in foreign policy, other aspects to be taken into account?
I think the best way to answer that is to sort of look at Joe Biden's experience as vice president. One of the decisions that Barack Obama made when he became president and Biden was his vice president is that Biden would be in the room when decisions were being made, that Biden would have an opportunity to offer his advice. And I think it is very clear from the way that Biden talks about his time as vice president that he greatly valued that fact, because not all presidents have accorded their vice president that level of input. And I think it's very clear in how President Biden, candidate Biden, talked about his presidency, that he intends to extend and is extending the same courtesy, the same opportunity to Vice President Harris. And I think one of the things that really stands out about the Biden administration is the degree to which it talks about itself as the Biden-Harris administration, and in terms of how many times you see the president in a public setting with the vice president also in the room. And again, I think that is Joe Biden trying to signal to the world that he is close to his vice president, that his vice president plays an important role in the decision that his administration makes. Having said that, I will note at the end of the day, when one is president, it's ultimately the president who decides. And as Vice President Biden has noted on a number of occasions, there are instances in which he advised President Obama on something, and President Obama made a different choice. And I suspect the same thing will be true in the Biden-Harris administration. That's not a sign of weakness. It's just a sign at the end of the day, presidents and only presidents in the American system are responsible for making these decisions.
Dear James Lindsay, we have been exploiting your time, we have been exploiting your knowledge, and we have been enjoying and benefiting from your knowledge. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your open, also very, very open opinions on all these different questions, and many of them, or practically all of them, were quite intense and challenging. So thank you so much for being our guest. We truly hope that you will be able to visit the glacier behind me. It's the Stubai Glacier, and Innsbruck cake and bread and sausage and beer. And you didn't
I said coffee. I also had coffee.
Whatever. We would be more than happy and also grateful to have the opportunity to welcome you, to bring you in more as whatever lecturer, speaker, partner at the MCI. But once again, on behalf of our institution, of our faculty, of our students, of all the guests being part in this live talk today, thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Andreas, let me just say thank you for doing a skillful job moderating the conversation. It has been a real pleasure. And to the people who offered up questions, thanks. They were really terrific. And again, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you today. And I hope someday to come visit the MCI in person. So all I'll say is thank you and stay well.
Let me conclude with apologies to our guests if I was not able to put forward all the questions. I see them still coming in, so perhaps there will be another opportunity with James Lindsay on campus or via digital means. But now let me look a bit into the future. Our next distinguished guest will be Katharina Reiche. She is Chief Executive of West Energy in Essen, Germany, which is an important part of the Innogy energy group. And she is now also the president of the hydrogen initiative of Germany, of the Federal Republic of Germany, bringing together all these different stakeholders and interest groups. So Katharina Reiche, she's also a member of the MCI Advisory Board. Welcome to Katharina Reiche, and to have you here as guests of the MCI on February the 8th, 1700, our time, 5 p.m. And the week afterwards, we will be happy to welcome Andreas Ritter. Andreas Ritter, he is Austrian and Central European head of the largest real estate consultancy in the world. And he will talk on the impact of the coronavirus on real estate markets. Other distinguished guests coming in and looking forward to include, for instance, Jens Spahn. Jens Spahn is the Federal Minister of Health Affairs of the Federal Republic of Germany. Then Wolfgang Burtscher, he's Director General at the European Commission for Agriculture, Agricultural Policies, and more. Have a look at our website, be our guest, contribute with as many questions as you like. And now I wish you a very, very nice evening. And let me conclude with final thanks to our distinguished guest of today, James M. Lindsay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andreas. Stay well.